Thank you, Dr. Blackmore, for that warm welcome and introduction and overview of some of my work. Thank you for even inviting me to be present with y'all today. Thank you to President Henderson and Provost Joshi for inviting me as well to be the keynote for the convocation today. I'm excited to be with y'all, even though I cannot physically be with y'all. I feel like I'm with y'all anyways, because I've spent some time getting to know y'all as I think a little bit about this process of becoming a Hispanic-Serving Institution. So welcome faculty, staff, students to this convocation and to my presentation. I'm gonna go ahead and talk through the book, Becoming Hispanic-Serving Institutions. Dr. Blackmore did a great overview and introduction to the book. And so I'm gonna get a little bit more into the book, Becoming HSIs. If you want to get in contact with me following this presentation, my contact information is here. You can welcome to reach out to me. You can follow me on Twitter, follow me on Instagram, and also there's my contact information or my website. So feel free to reach out and ask me more about some of these things that I talk about with y'all today. So I start with just a basic overview of Hispanic-Serving Institutions. I know y'all are a Hispanic-Serving institution. But the complexities of actually embracing that identity is where my work steps in and where I typically give large lectures, public lectures about what does it mean to actually become a Hispanic-Serving institution, thinking about HSIs and becoming an HSI as a process, not just something that that you get just because you get the percent. So this is the percentage. HSIs, you have to enroll at least 25% Latinx, Hispanic students, and 50% of them are supposed to be low income. This makes you a quote unquote eligible HSI. You still have to go through the process of being recognized to be an HSI. And then the work, what I would say the hard work starts after that. There are 539 HSIs as of 2018. So by this fall, 2020, we're probably up into 560 or so. We're moving at a pace of about 20 or 30 new HSIs per year. There are almost 20 in New Jersey, and in New York, I believe there are almost 40. I think it's 17 and 38, something along those lines. So you see where y'all are at in the surrounding area. There are a good number of HSIs. HSIs, what I think makes the becoming HSI one of the most difficult things is that they're very diverse. And so it's hard for an HSI to say, we're an HSI, we have 25% Latinx students, let's just follow the ideal model, because there is no ideal model. It's hard to copy, which institutions of higher ed like to copy or do similar things or find models that work. And that's just hard to do because of the fact that they're super diverse. So you can see they're large, they're small, they're research, they're liberal arts, they basically every type of institution could be an HSI. So I often get campuses to start thinking about what does it mean to be an effective name your institution type HSI. So for example, if you're a rural institution, what does it mean to be a rural institution? If you're an urban institution, what does it mean to be an urban HSI? So rather than just thinking about HSI as this monolith, thinking much more complexly about how different these different types of institutions are just based on who they are at their core. The profile of students is changing, but this is generally the profile of students at HSIs. They tend to enroll a larger population of students of color. Some more recent reports that have come out from the American Council on Education actually shows data to suggest that they are not predominantly white anymore. That was always the early arguments that HSIs could be 25% Latinx and 75% white enrolling. That's not the case anymore. They're enrolling Black students, Asian American students, Latino students, and students of every different type of racial ethnic background. As you all know at your institution, all the different types of diversity falls under the HSI umbrella. Low income, they tend to be low income, often first generation to college and often first generation to the US, which could mean they might speak multiple languages, more than one language. So language becomes a part of this identity, as I call it, an identity. Data suggests that over and over and over, we keep looking at the data that show students that enter HSIs are more likely to have lower math and SAT scores when they enter, which means they might be considered underprepared. And so HSIs have to embrace that this is their population and this is our students. How do we make sure our students get through and succeed despite the fact that they may have things, barriers that they've faced throughout their educational careers. So in the book, I talk about these greater complexities around becoming an HSI. And the way I talk about it is that HSI, because it's attached to the racial ethnic identity of students, Latinx or Hispanic, it is a racialized institution. In the United States, we call these minority-serving institutions. Historically, Black colleges and universities, tribal colleges, and also Hispanic-serving institutions fall within this racial category of MSI. But what I talk about in the book is that because they have a racial identity attached to them at the organizational level, they become racialized. And in this country, when you become racialized, as we know, and as we've been seeing over the last few months, just a rise in the focus on race and racism in this country. Those of us that study this know, we've been talking about this forever, that like race is an important construct in this country, and the way people interact with you is often based on your race, whether or not you can advance, get jobs, buy a house, where you live, where you go to school. All of those things are attached to people's racial identity. And there isn't justice. There's lots of injustices in all of those things that I mentioned. And so when I think about this identity connected to an institution, the same thing happens, that we start to question whether these institutions are good. Are they good? That's how I approach this work of saying, is an HSI good? Is it comparable to Harvard? Is it comparable to Stanford? Is it comparable to the University of Michigan? These institutions that are historically predominantly white, but are the most elite institutions in the country. Are they good? And what does good even mean? Because that is a social construct as well. Just like race, it's a social construct of what does it mean to be a good institution when you enroll a predominantly, your student body is predominantly students of color. What does it mean to be good to students of color? And that's what HSIs have to do, because otherwise this idea of racialization is wrapped up in the idea that race, there are various races that are inferior to other races. And that's a whole nother lecture in itself, and this idea of racialization, of how this country has come to value whiteness and attach itself to whiteness, and anybody that's not white or anything that's not white falls into this hierarchical category of what is good in this country. And so for institutions of higher ed, like HSIs and or predominantly white institutions or HBCUs or MSIs in general, there's this process of connected to what is good and what does it mean to be an effective HSI. And because of this idea of racialization and attaching race to an institution, what we see is that HSIs are often undervalued, that people are constantly questioning whether they're good, are they graduating students effectively, they're underfunded, and that's doesn't always come into the conversation. And so there's a hierarchy of institutions as well. When we think about graduation rates, this tends to be the #1 way that colleges and universities and the federal government, and often state governments, determine whether or not an institution is effective. They want institutions, they meaning policymakers and the legislature, they want institutions of higher ed to graduate students in an effective amount of time. And typically that's 150%, or for a 4-year institution, 6 years. For a 2-year institution, it'd be 3 years. And that's how we often determine whether or not an institution is effective. The average graduation rates, 150% graduation rate for HSIs is 39%, which is below the national average, which is 56%. Broad access institutions like HSIs tend to fall in a much lower percentage, while more selective institutions, which are also the whiter institutions, have much higher graduation rates. So for me, graduation rates can't be the sole determinant of whether or not an HSI is good. And that's when my work really steps in to think about what else besides graduation makes an institution good. Not to say that we shouldn't graduate students, we absolutely should. And we need mechanisms in place to graduate students. But as I often say, if your students graduate, but they experience racism and microaggressions, or they don't see themselves in the curriculum or anywhere in the institution, is that a good experience? Does that make you an HSI? Just because they graduate, that's more a reflection of them, not the institution, right? That a student can be resilient, they can push through those things. Particularly students of color have been pushing through those sort of things their whole careers. So they can do that. They can manage with a little support from the institution. They can get through despite the fact that those things, and we know it's documented, continue to happen at HSIs and predominantly white institutions. So I propose this typology for us to think about this in a more complex way, rather than just focusing solely on student outcomes, which is the student outcomes high or low axis. That's the y-axis. If you're producing or graduating students at high rates or producing academic outcomes at high rates, then you would be in those top two quadrants, either what I call Latinx producing or Latinx serving. If you're lower, or you're not graduating students in an effective amount of time or a sufficient amount of time, or what people say 150% amount of time, then you would be in the lower quadrants. The second dimension that I bring in on the x-axis is, what about your culture? What about your climate? What about your organizational structures? Do students of color get to have what I now call a liberatory education? I've been talking a lot about liberatory education, of like HSI should be spaces of liberation. If we got to this ideal place of what an institution of higher ed that's serving predominantly students of color should be, it should be liberating. It should be a space where students of color get to learn about themselves. They get to grapple with their racial ethnic identity. They get to learn about their history. They get to see themselves in the classroom, whether through the faculty or through the curriculum. They get to participate in co-curricular activities that center their ways of knowing. They get to go out into the community and serve their communities rather than communities that they're not that attached to or not as concerned with. So that's the culture. That's where I say, if you are really centering Latino students in your culture and your climate across the institution, then you would be more in the Latinx enhancing category. Latinx enrolling has been this place where most people say HSI start. They enroll a large percentage of Latinx students, but they don't necessarily graduate them in high numbers or produce high equitable outcomes and or provide these environments where students are really feeling like they belong in the culture. And so I spent a lot of time really grappling with the culture piece or the organizational piece, or I call it different things in different models. Culture, organizational culture, climate, it could be the campus climate. It could also be the organizational structures, depending on which model I'm talking about. So the struggle to become an HSI and or Latinx enhancing or fully Latino producing is that there's no historical mission to serve Latinxs. I often start with the mission. Like I can go on an institution's website and say, let me look at the mission. Well, there's no stated commitment to actually serve students of color or Latino students. And I've been actually encouraging institutions to really think beyond diversity, because there's often diversity and inclusion in mission statements, but there's not necessarily words like anti-racism or racial justice or anything that would promote that we want to disrupt systems of oppression that have always held people of color back. So is your mission going to center Latino students? That's something I would ask an HSI to really think about. Is it in our mission? Is it in our purpose? Is it in our strategic plan to actually serve Latino students and or Black, Indigenous people of color, BIPOC, which is the term that we're starting to use for students of color, that encompassing all students of color. Which HSIs, just because they're HSIs doesn't mean they're exclusionary. I'm very big on that. It's like, doesn't mean HSI should never mean excluding Black, Indigenous people of color. It should be inclusion. It should be inclusionary, particularly if you're really centering students of color and or your Latino students. HSIs, however, lack a full understanding of how to do this. And I know that because I work with a lot of HSIs and most are in the same place of like, how do we disrupt the inherently white structures that have always been in place? And that's where most institutions start this work. When they start to really think, how do we get to that place of actually being HSIs? They have to start somewhere. And that's where I would say start. What are dominant white practices? And so I outline various white practices. And you'll see in my slides, I often cite some of the great scholars, higher education scholars and or urban ed scholars around some of these ideas I'm talking about. And Lori Patton Davis talks about this, about what does it mean to have institutions that are so committed to whiteness that they uphold white structures. Like, she talks about how institutions that hold on to whiteness privilege white students, they center white experience and voices, they uphold the white racial privileging, silence students of color often, they marginalize, trivialize, and or appropriate experiences and voices of students of color. And there's so many examples, numerous examples. There's probably students sitting, listening to this lecture thinking, yep, I've experienced that. I've been asked to show my ID. I've been asked, the campus security or campus police have asked me to show my ID to get into the library. Why is that? I've sat through classes where nobody ever recognized my racial ethnic identity. I've sat through classes where I didn't get to speak my, if I speak multiple languages, I don't get to actually use them in the classroom. There's lots of ways in which this looks. I have a student I'm working with, a doctoral student, and she's looking at civic engagement on our campus and how the civic engagement practices, despite the fact that many institutions value civic engagement, they don't typically center students of color or communities of color, right? They're operating from a very white framework, which is often a savior framework or this pursuit of justice for altruistic reasons or personal reasons versus actually wanting to uplift the communities. So that's something to think about, is like, how are we upholding our white structures in the curriculum and the co-curricular and decision-making processes? Dominant white practices are completely embedded in the curriculum. I often encourage institutions to do a curricular audit and to look across the curriculum, and it can't just be on the backs of ethnic studies. I love ethnic studies. I'm a product of ethnic studies. I identify as Chicana because I am a product of Chicanx studies in California. California is leading the way on institutionalizing ethnic studies, and I'm all for it. But your ethnic studies, your Latino studies, your African-American studies, your Pan-African studies, your Muslim studies, your queer studies, those types of programs can't be the ones carrying the entire institution. So science, chemistry, history, social work, everybody's got to do it. Everybody's got to be on board with rethinking the curriculum about how we center minoritized voices. Some of the research would show that that's not happening even at HSIs. It's just not in the structures to center, or what Wade Cole in this article that I cite calls ethnocentric curriculum, meaning centered on one way of knowing. It's just not happening. Incidental HSIs are HSIs that become HSIs, and they are least likely to have a strong ethnocentric curriculum. So we've got to think more critically about where students are passing through, which curriculum they are, co-curricular structures, housing, cultural centers, student organizations, all those sort of things. How are they operating to uplift and to support students of color? So the racialization of HSIs, by the time I get to the end of the first chapter and go into the actual empirical chapters, I really solidify this argument around this racialized institution. And institutions need to make that decision. Are you okay with embracing an identity, Hispanic-serving identity, that is racialized? Right? Are people going to look at you in any sort of way? Is the state legislature going to look at you in a certain way? Is the federal government, like your peer institutions, what are they going to say about your connection to this identity? Because it is an identity. And we all have multiple identities. And HSI is one of those that I say, you've got to embrace on top of all of your other identities. Whatever it is you do well, great. Be an HSI really well also. Right? And among that HSI identity, make sure that means uplifting and supporting all students of color, not just Latino students. It should not be an identity that pits one group against another. So in the book, I go into these counter narratives, and shout out to Lambda Theta Alpha, because I have all these slides with Lambda Theta Alpha, and Kane University is the founding, that's where that's our motherland, which I know is in New Jersey. So I have to shout out Kane University and Lambda Theta Alpha, because I am a sister of Lambda Theta Alpha, a space that I would say does it really well, right? I think student organizations are often places where students turn to because everything else on the campus isn't for them. So organizations, often Greek organizations, are places where students can turn to and say, you know what, at least I feel empowered, and at least I feel seen in my student organization. And that's important, but it can't be the only place for students. So how do we elevate those feelings for people beyond just student organization? So I reframe research through these critical counter narratives. And I use this counter storing methodology, which is grounded in critical race theory. And critical race theory says that race and racism are so salient that we cannot not think about them. Like, you have to think about race, you have to think about racism on a daily basis within your institution, particularly if all of your students or a majority of your students are students of color. If you're not thinking about race on a daily basis, you're doing a disservice to your students. So I use this critical race methodology and storytelling to rethink what makes HSIs good, rather than just criticizing HSIs, what makes them good. And I worked with 3 institutions in Chicago, very different institutions. And in the book, I lay out stories and basically show how they fit into different types. Remember the typology? Latinx producing, Latinx serving, Latinx enhancing. I have 3 different institutions that fit into the different types. So I lay out, what does it look like to be Latinx producing? What does it look like to be Latinx enhancing? And I show that, but also the complexities. So one institution, ACU, I call ACU, they're pseudonyms. They would be the model Latinx enhancing institution. The graduation rates, the academic outcomes are quite low and quite inequitable for students of color. They need to address that, and they know it, and they grapple with that every day, but they do better when it comes to the cultural dynamic, like that they actually have programs and services and curriculum and community engagement with the Latino community. So that's, you know, a strength, but they also need to think about what else, right? What else is going on? Now, this institution is really fascinating because they talked a lot about tensions between races. And I say here, Black and brown tensions, because that's how they described it. And they often said, well, this is common in Chicago. We often have tension between Black and brown communities. And I questioned that. I said, but does that mean it's okay, right? Is it okay for you to have these racial tensions? Because if it is, if these are happening, then are you really an HSI? Because I don't think that you can have these racial tensions. There needs to be joint liberation of your communities of color on these campuses. So they had some strengths, but they also had some challenges, including documented racism and microaggression in the classroom. This is quite common at HSIs. It probably happens at your institution. It basically happens at all institutions. So to say it doesn't would be a stretch, because it absolutely does. And listen to students, and listen to faculty, and listen to staff. Listen to administrators when they say that they do experience racism and microaggression on a daily basis. It's absolutely true. We absolutely need to value that and understand and address it and figure out, how do we address those things? So I lay out this model of what a Latinx enhancing organization identity looks like. And in the chapter, I talk a lot about this move to social justice curriculum. I go back and forth. I call it culturally enhancing curriculum, socially just curriculum, anti-racist curriculum, and programs as well. Socially just programming as well, I think needs to happen. This institution talked a lot about the need for more faculty and staff of color, but the reality is we need our white faculty and staff on campus to also be committed to social justice. So I think having more people of color on campus is absolutely necessary, particularly at the decision-making levels. But your people who are not people of color, your white people, they got to be committed too. They have got to be roll up their sleeves and be on the ground with us saying, how are we going to become a racially just HSI rather than just an Hispanic enrolling HSI? So everybody's got to be on board with this very organizational construct. The second institution that I highlight, APC, they actually are the one that I identify as Latinx serving, that they do a pretty good job, but they're also an anomaly. They're a very unique institution. They were founded as a bilingual institution. And so they're unique in that sense. They actually serve a Spanish-speaking community that comes into the institution and wants to be bilingual, that they are their dominant language is Spanish and they want to speak English. And so they do this curriculum. They provide this curriculum that allows people to become bilingual and also get an associate's degree along the way. They do have several bachelor's degree programs as well, which is why they fit into this category of four-year institutions, which are three institutions are all four-year institutions. So I propose that their they're just this unique space that feels like what I call a third space, when I don't call it a third space. There's plenty of people that have, Chicana feminists have talked about third space. I draw largely from educational research. Dr. Chris Gutierrez has talked tremendously about third space in a bilingual classroom. And so I propose at the organizational level, what does it look like for an institution to value students' ways of knowing, or what I call here on the screen, student knowledge, and also bring that together with what here on the slide is called population measures. These are the things that would be like your state level policies, your federal level policies. How do you value all those things and bring them together in this institutional scripts, what Chris Gutierrez and others who theorize about third space call institutional scripts, right? The scripts that bring the two together, these two seemingly different narratives together, in order to value your students' ways of knowing. And so I talk a lot about that in that second chapter, or in that second empirical chapter. The third and final institution I talk about is a Latinx producing institution. They graduate students really well. They graduate them in less than 4 years. They do a really good job. Those students go on and get jobs. They're good in that sense, but they are doing it in a race, what I call race neutral way, meaning not race conscious at all, not centering the students of color at all, no curricular or co-curricular structures at all that center their ways of knowing, and their faculty, staff, administration is predominantly white. So this institution I lay out as like, great, you're producing at high levels. The federal government or all these institutions here that I talk about that care about outcomes only would say, you're doing a great job. Right? These types of institutions, these external, what I call external influencers on post-secondary institutions, they think if you graduate students, you're developing the workforce, you're contributing to STEM fields, that you're doing a great job as an institution. I agree. Those are all important things. But they never name race as something that needs to happen, or racial justice that needs to happen. So until these external organizations start to elevate racial justice, HSIs are going to continue to operate in this way that feels like they're not doing a good job, even if they are centering race and centering the racial ways of knowing of their students. And so this institution, they used intrusive advising, they had great financial aid and scholarship packages, and they did great career development and experiential learning, very high graduation rates, but it was in a race neutral way. And so that's how I, frame this institution. And so at the end, you're thinking, well, I think you're thinking, I don't know. I don't know how other people perceive the book, but a lot of times people are saying, which of the three are we? Which one are we most aligned with? And that's where people start. And they're like, okay, if we're here, do we want to be here? Or do we want to move to another type among the 4 types that I talk about, the 4 types within typology. And so I propose some I offer some suggestions throughout the book of like, how do you do this better, right? Your curriculum, your programs have got to change. They've got to be grounded in justice and equity, the hiring of faculty and staff that are committed to that. Language is so important. We can't discount language. And there's lots of talk about not only Spanish, but also indigenous languages and other languages, all languages. There's all, to be multilingual is a good thing. It should be seen as a good thing. It's cognitively a very powerful thing to speak multiple languages, and we should value that 100%. Translanguaging is an important aspect and an important outcome from institutions of higher ed, that isn't always valued. And at the end of the day, if you're not thinking about race and you're not race conscious, are you really an HSI? That's where I want to leave y'all as you start to think about this process of embracing your HSI identity, because I think y'all are there. I think you have great programs and services. You're a commitment. You have way more than 25% Latinx students on campus and students of color. But are we doing it in a way that the culture, the environment, the structures are centering race and really elevating racial justice for our students? So that's what I'm going to leave y'all with today. And I hope to interact with y'all more and think more about this, because this is a long-term process. It's not something that happens overnight. It's something that the institution has to commit to and move forward with. So thank you very much for having me.